Singh from Law Answer Online. Today we have Mr. Udin Mukherjee with us to talk about the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. Mr. Mukherjee retired from Indian Police Service after more than 3 decades of service. He's practicing lawyer and is a member of the Supreme Court Bar Association. He is the author of Amazon best ranking books, The Law of Bail and The Law of Prevention of Money Laundering. You may find the links in description below. Let us start. So can you tell us a little bit about Prevention of Money Laundering Act? How did it come into existence?
You see, in order to understand why the Money Laundering Act was enacted, it is important to understand what money laundering is. So money laundering, basically laundering is washing. So the washing of dirty money is money laundering. And how do you get dirty money? Dirty money can be had through crime.
Of course.
It can be had through things like smuggling. It can be had through concealing earned income, black money. It may not have been earned through crime, but it still is black money. So this kind of money, which is not in formal circulation in the economy, when you want to put it back into the economy as honest money, then you have to launder that money. So you have to also understand the process of money laundering. So the process of money laundering, technically speaking, it involves something like placement, layering, and integration. Leaving that aside for the moment, I'll give you a few examples. Let us, for instance, imagine that a smuggler has a lot of black money, which he sends by hawala to his correspondent, say, in the US, say $1 million. Now he wants to get it back as white money into India. So one way could be, ostensibly he manufactures stuff for exporting to his buyers in the US and he over invoices it. So he actually manufactures stuff for about rupees 100. He invoices it to the extent of rupees 300. Then he sends it abroad. Then people there, because they already have his money. So what they do, they send him 300. Right. So now 200 is washed. And the advantage is that most of your export income is either tax-free, or it invites a very low rate of taxation, or it enables quite a few incentives for you. So not only is our friend laundering his money, he's also taking advantage of the foreign currency support policies that we have in this country. He could also go out and play at the casino in Las Vegas if he has an arrangement there. So he says, okay, I'll put in $100. You declare a jackpot of $1 million, so that is legally earned. What has happened in this country is that recently, we have an act called the FCRA, Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, which has recently been tightened a good deal. The regulations have been made stricter, but say about 4 or 5 years ago, it was a convenient way for foreign money to come to NGOs in this country,
Right.
non-government organizations. The oversight and the supervision by government was minimal. So a lot of money would come to the NGOs. These NGOs were propped up only to receive
They want money.
such money, right? And then they would, give it to suppliers or send it to suppliers of stuff, etc., whatever. So the money would become white. Then some of this money is then put into genuine businesses, where it multiplies after having been laundered abroad. It comes in, so it's layered through various businesses. 1, 2, 3, 4. It comes out as shining white money. Now the problem was, black money was throughout the world causing upheavals in the economies of the countries. Because development expenditure cannot be incurred by any country unless it has taxes. And if taxes are avoided, how do you feed the poor? How do you develop the infrastructure? And also, much of this money was being used to fund terrorism.
That's a major problem.
Major issue. So the countries all got together and they formed a financial action task force called the FATF. Very funny name, but but it is the FATF. Now the FATF drew up a number of recommendations, 40 plus. The plus was for terrorist funding, and the 40 was for
Money laundering.
black money. It was on the basis of these recommendations and something known as the Palermo Convention on Black Money that this country and many other countries worldwide who were members of the FATF decided to or had to enact legislation to specifically prevent money laundering, and thus came into existence our own PMLE, Prevention of Money Laundering Act. The preamble itself says that it has come into being because of the FATF recommendations and the recommendations of the Palermo Convention. There is also an exchange of information group which has been set up after a meeting of these countries at Egmont Palace in Brussels. It's called the Egmont Group. And the countries which are members of the FATF exchange information among themselves about black money so that the global war against black money can be successful. So that is why the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. I hope that makes...
Yeah, that explains
Okay,
pretty much.
it does.
of
Good.
its existence. So what are the offences under Prevention of Money Laundering Act?
You see, there are no offences, plural. There is just one offence.
Okay.
The entire Money Laundering Act has just one section. Section 3 to define just one offence, and that is the offence of money laundering. Unfortunately, in our country, the Act has been drafted at complete variance from the recommendations of the FATF and those of the Palermo Convention. So what does Section 3 say? Whoever is directly or indirectly involved with the proceeds of crime, they call it.
Okay.
The proceeds of crime. Black money, proceeds of crime. Whether he is doing it knowingly or is simply involved. So the great thing about it is, if a person just gets involved without knowing that he is dealing with black money, he is also committing the offence of money laundering. Further it says, the proceeds of crime, whether they are concealed or they are in possession, whether they are acquired or they are in use, and or they are projected as untainted property which is not tainted by crime. But if you look at these words, two words, possession and use, you will find that if you club it with the fact that actually involved, you will find that a person can be completely unknowing, isn't it? So unfortunately, Section 3 of the Money Laundering Act omits a cardinal principle of our law. A cardinal principle of the criminal law in this country is the principle of mens rea, or the guilty mind. So the cardinal principle in this country is, unless a person has a guilty mind and intention to commit a crime, he should not be charged with the crime. That is an overriding principle which we have followed ever since the time in the 19th century when the IPC was brought into existence by the British, and the Evidence Act and the CRPC.
PMLA takes away that.
PMLA takes away that protection, that fundamental underlying principle. So in PMLA, if the man has a guilty mind or does not have a guilty mind, it is immaterial. If perchance, knowingly or simply unknowingly he gets involved in either the use or the possession of proceeds of crime, then he has committed the offence of money laundering. So this is what the offence is about. Unfortunately, as I keep telling you, Section 3 is draconian in many ways, which I just explained to you. Further, it is draconian because you see, if you look at the FATF upon which it is based. What does the FATF say? Money laundering is the processing of criminal proceeds to disguise their illegal origin. So if somebody has been disguising, not to disguise, chupana chahte, if you want to disguise, you've got to have a guilty mind, right?
Right.
If I don't have a guilty mind, why will I disguise?
Absolutely.
Right?
Right.
This has not found reflection in our own section 3 of the PML. Similarly, Palermo Convention says acquisition, possession or use of property knowing that at the time of receipt such property is the proceeds of crime. But in our case, he may be doing it knowingly or he may be just involved. So it is a draconian matter. Unfortunately, this entire thing of draconian law and guilty mind and what have you was tested in the court.
Okay.
There is a famous case of Srimati K. Saubhagya versus Union of India, where it was said, look, this violates a fundamental principle of the law.
All right.
The court says, in its wisdom said, that even if in a given case, a person who is not guilty of money laundering is erroneously prosecuted,
Okay.
the remedy is to move the appropriate forum, which means to appeal for termination of the prosecution, not to strike down the section itself.
Okay.
So the sanctity, the immutability of the section has been upheld by court, which says it can happen, somebody who is not guilty, inadvertently in possession, etc., 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 he may be prosecuted. But for that alone, the section cannot be changed. The section remains. So this is what it is all about.
So it would not be wrong to say it has a lot of loopholes.
No, it is riddled with loopholes. The Act itself, we are just talking of Section 3. If you go through the body of the Act, long process, you will find that it has very many lacunae. Very many lacunae. And it really is not a just and fair law.
Of course.
And our constitution says that nobody should be deprived of his life or liberty without a procedure established by law. And the Supreme Court in the Maneka Gandhi case way back had said procedure established by law means it should be just, fair and reasonable.
Right.
At least I do not find, and plenty of others do not find this provision to be just, fair and reasonable.
And that's why it's.
But we live with it. We live
Yeah,
with
yeah,
it. We live with it.
Okay. So what is the punishment of money laundering?
Okay, the punishment is, you see, PMLA has a schedule to it,
Okay.
Part A. Now there are a lot of offences mentioned in it.
I'm sure.
Those offences cover almost everything: the IPC, the Forest Act, the Environment Act, the Drugs Act, the Counterfeit Currency Act, smuggling, etc., etc. They cover everything. So, if the money has come from any of those offences, then the minimum punishment is 3 years, which may go up to 7 years, apart from a fine.
Okay.
So 3 is the minimum, go up to 7 years, and also a fine. But if it pertains to drugs, Riya Chakravarti,
Oh, yes. Everybody knows that.
then the punishment may extend to 10 years. The punishment may extend to 10 years. Now, this is a very funny provision, as I will presently explain to you. Now, remember that some person must have committed the offence in the schedule.
Knowingly or unknowingly.
In the schedule,
Yeah.
right? Which is why now, imagine, for example, I commit an offence of cheating. Now, cheating, according to the IPC, invites a punishment for up to 1 year or with fine. Now, I cheat Mr. X of a sum of rupees 1,000. I'm caught. I'm tried. And bhai, this man is cheated. So he is punished for 1 year and maybe some fine.
Right.
But that 1,000 rupees that I had with me all along was tainted money. It was proceeds of crime.
Yeah.
And I have not told anybody that I am holding those proceeds of crime. So I get booked under the Money Laundering Act. And for that, the minimum punishment is 3 years.
3 years. That's a
So
contradictory.
that's a huge contradiction, especially when our constitution very clearly says, Article 20, no person shall be prosecuted and punished for the same offence more than once.
Right.
Well, I committed cheating, I paid the price. After paying the price, I am booked yet again for the same offence, basically, in my opinion. And I am now sent to jail for 3 years.
Right.
This was also examined by the court. And the court said, no, this is not the same offence. Right? So this principle of our constitution is based on a Latin expression. Nemo debet vis vexari. Nobody shall be vexed, prosecuted for the same offence twice. But the court said, look, no. Cheating is one offence and money laundering is another offence. So he is not being prosecuted for the same offence. He is being prosecuted for a different offence. Therefore, this part of the statute is also completely valid and in keeping with our constitutional requirements. People like me may differ, but this is the law as it stands today. आज law यही है. This is the law as it stands.
So how can the property of a person be attached under PMLA?
Okay, that is governed by Section 1 and Section 5. Now, under PMLA, there is a provision for a director who may also authorize a deputy director. Now, in India, the director and deputy director belong to the Enforcement Directorate, ED. Aajkal to you hear that name continuously. The ED raided this, the ED raided that, the ED did this, the ED did that. Now, the director or deputy director, if a crime has been committed under that Schedule A and he is of the opinion that there is a property, tainted property, which needs to be attached, he can attach this property for anything up to 180 days. But there is a condition. The condition is, in respect of that offence, A final report, जिसको हम लोग चार्जशीट कहते हैं, should have been filed by the police or the investigating agency for that principal crime under Section 173 of the CRPC in the court of competent jurisdiction. Okay, so that is absolutely clear. The second part is, okay, even if he does not file a final report, the investigator, not our ED wala, the other chap who is investigating the principal crime, if he has filed an FIR and informed the magistrate of competent jurisdiction, even that is enough. Now you understand the beauty of this. He filed an FIR. Our chap is not convicted. And in this country we have always said a person should be regarded as innocent until proven guilty, but no. FIR ho gaya, property is also tainted. The third is even more interesting provision which says that if a FIR or a final report for a similar offence has been registered in another country against this person, then also his property here can be attached. This is the first part. But there is an even more interesting second part. The second part is if the director or deputy director feels he has no time to wait for a final report, for an FIR or for anything, but he feels that this is tainted property and it will disappear. So if he has reasons to believe, so he will record those reasons to believe and then he will simply attach the property. As simple as all that. The point even more interesting is that this is the provision 1 was the registering of a FIR or a final. Provision 2 is even if nothing is done. Now provisions 2 starts with notwithstanding anything here above said. Now in law it's regarded as a non-obstante clause. कि ऊपर जो भी बोला गया है doesn't matter,
Doesn't matter, right?
right? Which gives supreme authority to the ED.
They can attach anything that they believe
They,
is untainted.
they believe, and they have no time to wait for FIR or final report or anything. They just believe. And they record their reasons to believe in writing.
Okay.
Even this bit about requirement of recording their belief in writing was brought to court. There was a case where the director or the deputy director did not. Court said it's a technical matter, Baba. If he was convinced, he was
He
convinced.
was convinced. Okay.
Right? So this is a technical matter. For a technical matter, you cannot hold up the majesty of the law. Right? So the majesty of the law cannot be held. So this is what the court says. So the second proviso, he is dispensing entirely for the with the prior requirements in the first proviso. For making an attachment order, he just goes ahead and does it. This was also tested, as I said, in the court. The famous case is K. Rathinam versus Union of India, where the court also clarified that thanks to that non-obstante clause, the second proviso takes priority over the first proviso. It is attached to the first proviso, okay. But in terms of weightage or importance, the second proviso is not subject to the first proviso, it stands alone and by itself. This was the judgment of the court. It also said that the property of any person can be attached.
Oh. Like they just have to believe that.
They just have reason to believe, and then they can attach any person's property, regardless of whether any criminal action has been taken or not taken.
So you said they take it for 180 days. So what happens after 180 days?
Okay, what happens after 180 days is the PMLA, under the PMLA, an adjudicating authority has been constituted.
Okay.
Appointments to the AA, as it is called, adjudicating authority, are made by the central government.
Okay.
There's a chairman and there are members. It's like a tribunal.
Okay.
Now, within 30 days of the seizure or attachment, as the case may be, the director or deputy director, anyway, I'll call it director, has to send a complaint to the adjudicating authority. Upon receipt of that complaint, which should naturally mention what has been attached or seized, etc., etc., the AA shall issue a show cause notice to the concerned party. Then give a hearing to the concerned party. If after giving hearing, the AA is of the opinion that the property has been justifiably attached or seized, right, the AA can further attach it for 365 days or until such time as the formal offence of money laundering is decided by the competent special court. AA is not the deciding court. It has a very limited jurisdiction.
Right.
Property attached, they send a complaint and the AA issues a show cause notice. There is a hearing, and after the hearing, the AA reaches its conclusion and says, all right, it looks like this is tainted property, or property may be equivalent in value to the tainted property or whatever, 365 days kar do, or for the duration the trial of the offence of money laundering is in progress, whichever comes later. So the funny thing is, a person who is not guilty, hypothetically, may lose his property for years together. With 365 days to hai, uske baad if the trial takes 2 years, 3 years, no recourse to the property. Ultimately, it may get confiscated if he is convicted. But if he is not convicted and it is restored to him, he has lost use of that property. Right? The other part of it is, this complaint to the AA is a very peculiar thing. The AA is not a court.
Of course.
AA doesn't have the powers of the court either under the CRPC or under the CPC.
Okay.
So why the complaint? Then we are still not sure. Nobody in the legal profession still knows what is the nature of the complaint that the ED files in court. The ED has a practice of registering something known as ECIR, Economic Crimes Information Report. But it does not send it to any magistrate. Unlike the FIR, which is immediately sent to a magistrate. Ultimately, when the charge sheet it files in court, ECIR uske saath lag ke, it goes to the court. So these are aspects which are not really understood. And this concept of the court that you can seize any property also involves certain times third party rights.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which again, can be a very embarrassing thing and a very unjust thing at times.
Yeah.
Now, when it says that any property can be attached, now this means that suppose the director goes to seize one property and it is with any person. Because as I told you, anybody can be in possession.
Right.
Suppose I stole this phone and somebody else without knowing bought it from me thinking that it was my phone. He is still he is in possession of that property, so he is guilty of section 3.
Absolutely.
Money laundering because he is in possession. As he is indulging in the activity, knowingly is of no consequence. Now such a property is seized from any person. And also what courts have decided that if that particular property, this phone cannot be seized, property of equivalent value may be seized.
Okay.
So if this phone which I sold to Mr. X, which I had stolen,
Right.
if the ED goes to recover it from Mr. X and cannot find this phone, it may recover anything equivalent in value to the phone.
Okay.
This was, in a particular case, Deputy Director, ED versus Axis Bank and others, this issue became very heated. Under certain acts known as the Debt Recovery or Difficulties Removal Act, Debt Recovery, and something known as the SARFAESI Act, SARFAESI Act. Banks, they give money.
Okay.
People turn willful defaulters, they don't repay the money.
Right.
Some even run away abroad, which is of course very, very good for them. But those who stay here, now the banks have the powers, under the SARFAESI Act especially, to attach the property of the willful defaulter. And the SARFAESI Act also has a clause that notwithstanding anything herein contained or in any other law, this power to attach is unchallengeable.
Okay.
So banks like the Axis Bank and some other banks, State Bank, etc., had seized
The
property belonging to willful defaulters. Now, willful defaulter must also have committed an economic crime.
Right.
So the ED stepped in. ED stepped in and same property it also attached. So banks raised two arguments. First of all, bole bhaiya, when we have already attached it and we have to repay public money,
Right.
because when we liquidate this asset, the money will be used to repay the depositor, because after all it is the depositor's money which has been given in lending to the willful defaulter. Bank ka khud ka paisa to nahi hai na, they don't have their own money. So the bank said, look, why do we attach property? Why has the SARFAESI been enacted? Why has Debt Recovery Act been enacted? So that when a willful defaulter is defaulting to the tune of say hundreds of crores and we attach the property, then we auction it, so the money comes back, so the depositor feels safe and secure
Right.
that the bank is not sending his money down the drain. His life savings are not in jeopardy. Am I right? But the court said sorry. Court said sorry. The bank had another argument, and which was, Baba, much of this property which the ED is attaching right now was mortgaged and then attached by us even before the so-called economic offence was committed.
Okay.
This was his grandfather's property.
Right.
Grandfather was a guarantor. He gave his property. So the crime which the ED is chasing has no relation to this property, and it was in any way attached much before. So the court gave two observations. Number one, it said, Bhaiya, the PMLA is enacted after the SARFAESI Act. So this non-obstante clause of the SARFAESI is inferior to the non-obstante clause of the PMLA. Number one. Number two, because the property can be seized from any person and it can be equivalent in value. So it doesn't matter. Even if the property attached was not connected with the crime, it must have been equivalent in value. Otherwise, why would the ED seize it? What the court probably forgot, if you go by that logic, that the PMLA was enacted after the SARFAESI, then the what is it called, that Insolvency and Banking Code (IBC) has been enacted after the PMLA, which also has given similar powers. What will happen when they start seizing ED property? That question has not come to court so far. Let us see what happens when it does come to the court. So, my point overall is, and even other things, PMLA had a provision for arrest and granting of bail, which was so meaningless that it was thrown out by the Supreme Court, by judges of the stature of Rohinton Nariman, who said, so the government changed it, but that didn't make it any better. But they said, ye kahani fir kabhi. This story another day. But the point is, the PMLA is not a smooth act. The PMLA doesn't also always make sense in many ways. The only redeeming feature is it is needed. It is needed in order to counter the huge scourge of funding of terrorism. And this is the only tool which our agencies have to effectively throttle the financing of terrorism. And once you throttle the source of the money or the inflow of the money, you actually, in effect, you dispense with terrorism itself. Because if you can't buy guns, if you can't buy ammunition, if you can't buy explosives, if you cannot pay for safe houses, what can the terrorists do? Right. So there is a very loud and pronounced need for a PMLA. The only thing is the structuring and the drafting, in my opinion, leaves much to be desired. I hope that concludes our little interview today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you ever so much. Thank you.